Vaping has a chokehold on young Aussies. It feels like most places you go, you are bound to smell notes of lush ice. And the thing is, we know that it's bad for us, and yet so many of us are still vaping. 20% of 18 to 24-year-olds have vaped in the past 6 months, which is the highest of any age group. Even though we've had decades of successful anti-smoking campaigns in Australia that have taught us that smoking and nicotine are harmful, despite all of this, so many young people are still picking it up, and I want to know why. Why vaping has taken over and become so normalized despite us knowing the negative health outcomes, what's actually inside a vape, and how to successfully quit vaping for good. Over the next 3 episodes, I'm going to be chatting to young people and experts to get to the bottom of vaping culture in Australia. This is Vape Nation.
We're at Pedestrian HQ. It's a Gen Z workplace and heaps of people in the office vape. So I thought I'd put it to the vapers and non-vapers to see if any of us actually know what's inside a vape.
Not really.
No. I'm going to say a bit of rat poison.
There's like the battery.
Some sort of liquid.
I actually don't know. Oils? Maybe a spring? Powder? Bubblegum flavours? Is there a spring?
So let's go get some and find out. Despite the new government ban on single-use vapes, it was relatively easy to find a convenience store that would sell them to me. We've picked up 2 different styles. For legal reasons, we can't show you the packaging, but we've lined up to get them tested so we can see all the physical and chemical components that are inside them. 2 people who have been on the front line of vape research in Australia are chemical toxicologist Dr. Jodie Morgan and analytical chemist Dr. Celine Kelso at the University of Wollongong. They've been cranking open vapes to see what people have been inhaling, and they're going to test what's inside the ones I picked up. They've tested thousands of vapes since they started in 2019 and have seen a big shift in nicotine concentrations.
So over thousands devices we've tested so far, the average concentration is around 40 milligram per mil or 4%, whichever units you want to look at. So much higher than when we first started back in 2019, which the average concentration was only back then around 12 milligram per mil. So almost a 4-fold increase from the products back in 2019 to what you can find in terms of nicotine in samples today.
That means if you have a vape that contains 3,500 puffs, it's the equivalent of around 14 packets of cigarettes. So if you're going through a vape once a week, you'd be vaping approximately the equivalent of up to 2 packets of cigarettes a day. And now I am really eager to know just how much nicotine is in the vapes we picked up.
Most of these are quite often easy to crack up the top by just flicking in, especially if they have been opened before, or we can just push it a bit with the tools and the top and the bottom should come fairly easily. There we go. So it has a few wires attached, and now we push the whole thing out. So that is your vape. Then inside the vape, you'll have the mouthpiece where you have the user inhaling, and when it inhale, the sensor at the bottom will trigger the battery will turn on, which will ignite the coil, and the coil will vaporize the liquid, making the vapor that the person inhale.
I can already smell it.
Yes.
I can smell the mango immediately as soon as you opened it.
Oh, so you know what flavor it is.
Yeah. Now we need to remove the coil to get to the liquid inside. That's what we're going to test in the chemical analysis to see exactly what's being consumed when you vape. The liquid was way more sticky and pungent in smell than I was expecting. The other vape we brought in, Dr. Kelso hadn't seen before. Different vapes are constantly hitting the market, responding to the changing legislation and pushing the amount of nicotine that can be crammed inside a vape. But there are commonalities between vapes, with a sensor, battery, liquid, mouthpiece, and coil.
All right, so now we have our 2 samples. We just need to add a few more chemicals so we can put it on the machine and get the analysis happening.
Because the vape liquid is so thick, Dr. Kelso needs to dilute it with methanol so the machine can read the measurements. The samples go into the machine and then the computer does the rest of the job running the analysis. While we wait for the results, I want to pick Dr. Kelso's brain on all of the questions I have about vapes, like if the different coil makes a vape safer or more harmful.
So a brand new device, which is like the one you have had today, the coil. So what is getting heated by the battery when the sensor is activated? So you see a nice clean coil, so meshy style. So that's the same type of device that the one we just opened. It just has been used.
And that's why it tastes like that burning kind of taste, because the coil's like...
Well, it starts to degrade. So a different brand altogether of device that are constructed slightly differently. So this coil is a turnaround over a piece of cotton fabric, while this one is a meshy type, so like different construction altogether. So those ones are probably just coil on the packaging, while those ones are the one that would be advertised as mesh coil.
Is there any health benefits for a mesh coil versus like a cotton? No. Is there one chemical that creates the ice, you know, like Lush ice?
That's the coolants. Even though the ice name is on some of them, we have found through our studies that the coolant, so it's called WS23, that's the name of the chemical, is present in pretty much everything. And we believe that it's because the concentration of nicotine in the sulfone is quite high in those products. So adding that coolant into the mix of vapes will cool the throat that while you're ingesting or inhaling that high concentration of nicotine, basically calming it down. So people that have never smoked before can tolerate the high concentration of nicotine.
With such high concentrations of nicotine, vape manufacturers are finding different ways to make it more bearable on the body. One of the vapes tested in the lab contained ethylene glycol, one of the main components in antifreeze. It's banned in e-cigarettes in Australia, and in this lab, it was the first time it was found in a vape here. The vape they tested was confiscated from a school student, and it had 80 times the tolerable amount via inhalation, meaning the student who was inhaling this would have most likely experienced burning and it would have been highly irritable to their respiratory system.
Since the regulation, or just before the current regulation has been introduced, nicotine was clearly labeled onto those devices, whether it was on the box or the concentration on the device itself. Since the introduction of the TGO 1110, which is the current regulation, the word nicotine, the warning about nicotine, the percentage, the concentration, you name it relating to nicotine, are completely disappeared from those products. So today you pick up a vape, no indication of nicotine, you may not be aware that nicotine is contained in that when you start vaping.
Yeah, and I will add to that, I guess one of the issues is a lot of these disposable type devices are being sold via illicit means in Australia. So they're being sold over the counter illegally in places that they're not allowed to be sold because they contain nicotine. As a consequence of that, they often aren't abiding by the limited regulations that we do have. So we do have a regulation that limits the types of some compounds. We've got 8 compounds that are banned that aren't allowed in Australian e-cigarettes. We do find those compounds in about 3.4% of samples in these disposable devices, because if they're already not abiding by the law that says you can't sell nicotine, why would they abide by the law that says you can't have these dangerous compounds in there?
Nicotine increases your risk of respiratory, cardiovascular, and gastrointestinal disorders, as well as impacting your mental and reproductive health. And with such high concentrations of nicotine stored within a vape, this risk can become very real.
So we do have a lot of information about the ingestion toxicity of a lot of these, because they've been used in foods, particularly the flavourings, for a really long time. What we don't know is what happens when you inhale them. And obviously, when we ingest something, we have a thing in our body called a liver, and everything goes via the liver and the hepatic system first, where things are metabolized and any dangerous compounds can be filtered out. When we inhale, there is no liver that goes directly into our bloodstream and then directly around the rest of our body. So obviously, inhalation has a higher risk than ingestion because our body is designed to protect ourselves when we eat something, not as much to protect our bodies when we're inhaling.
But we don't know the long-term effects, so until we have more studies that study those long-term effects, and I guess have also that time elapsed to see what are the potential long-term effects on people that have started to vape when they were in 18, then we don't know what's going to happen.
But what we do know is that there is a vape analysis ready for us. Every time there's a bump in the line, that's a chemical that's been detected.
So looking at comparing both of them at the same time, the first striking is that we have a huge peak in both cases for nicotine. So they clearly contain both nicotine. This particular yellow one is contained about 50 milligram per mil, so the expected 5% that we would see for that brand and model. And then the second one that you have provided, it's a little bit less nicotine, but nonetheless still quite high concentration at 33.2 milligram per mil.
That is a huge amount of nicotine. They also both contain the cooling agent WS23 to combat the burning feeling of nicotine on your throat. And while there's little known about the risk of synthetic cooling agents, there's been reports of risks to human organs and animals. There was also a spike for benzoic acid, which enables a higher concentration
concentration of nicotine to be stored within the vape, and it also helps with cooling the throat. There's vegetable glycerin, which produces the cloud of smoke and, again, helps with cooling. Research on inhaling vegetable glycerin is still in its infancy, but one study has found that it can lead to lung inflammation. The other spikes were for chemical compounds that make up the flavours in the vape. You normally find these in lollies and lozenges, but again, we have research on eating them, not inhaling them, so we're not too sure what the effects are when they're inhaled. Now that we know what's inside a vape, it's time to understand their rise.
No one in the apartment had a vape. She was begging all of us to find one. She was on her knees at one point.
And so we've seen in Australia a real push, a real lobbying effort by front groups who are funded by the tobacco industry to relax Australia's vaping laws rather than strengthen them.
That's episode 2 of Vape Nation.